Okay, I want to welcome people to the EMP-E conference and to the first day of it. My name's Anthony Patt. I'm a professor of climate policy at ETH Zurich. I'm the coordinator of the Sentinel project, one of the main projects involved in this conference and indeed organizing the conference this year, along with other partners. So I want to welcome you most of all to this conference and really just say a few words at the beginning before I turn over to the next speaker. So I think, as all of you know, starting next week is a global conference that people are waiting for, the COP26 in Glasgow, which every day I'm reading newspaper articles about what to expect there. I have to say, from my perspective, and I'm a coordinating lead author of the IPCC work on international climate governance. From my perspective, what we can expect from COP26 is actually completely dependent on what's happening in every single country, all the countries that we're living in, because in fact, negotiators are not negotiating between themselves what they're going to do. They're going to be talking about and reporting on what their own governments have already promised. So for example, my own country of Switzerland, our federal council, which is the executive branch of the government, has decided to aim for climate neutrality by 2050. They decided this 2 years ago. They're going to report on this in Glasgow. And the issue is that this depends on achieving stuff within our own country. The fact is, we still don't know within Switzerland, and probably your country is the same. We still don't know which technical measures will be needed, or which policy measures will promote the technical measures. And our answers to both will keep changing because the technologies are not standing still. They're moving forward. The policies that we're putting in place to try to reconfigure the energy system are not standing still. They're going to be changing. We're going to have to redesign everything as we go. So the simple fact is that energy system modelers are going to be really busy for the next 30 years, and getting to know each other and getting to know each other's work is a very good place to start. And this conference I see within Europe is the place where that happens, perhaps more than any other conference. It's the meeting of the European projects that are working on energy system modeling and how we're going to solve this amazing challenge for the next generation. So before I turn over to the next speaker, I just have a few announcements, and these are just housekeeping issues for this panel. First of all sessions will be recorded and streamed to YouTube under license. If you wish to remain anonymous, just please turn off your camera. Everyone, please post any questions that you have about what the speaker has said using the Q&A function, and these will be answered directly or passed on to the chair for the communal questions and answers. The chairs of future sessions in EMP-E, please close your session when it's finished, and this allows us to use the same meeting address for later sessions. And then finally, participants to the poster and exhibit session on day 2, please bring a drink or two for the virtual drinks on the roof terrace or the pub. We'll have several settings, all sunny in various cities, for participants to break and get to know each other privately. This lobby area will remain open for all the conference sessions. Okay, so now I'd like to turn over to Jeroen Schuppers from DG, from the European Commission, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for your introduction, and good morning, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here at this first day of the 3-day conference with a very well-chosen subject, the energy system modeling for supporting the European Green Deal. This European Green Deal, I would call it the North Star of Europe for the next 30 years to reach our climate objectives, being climate neutral by 2050. And we just heard from you, Tony, that energy modelers will be busy those 30 years from now. Research and innovation and modeling will play a strategic role in achieving this objective, because many of the technologies that we need for climate neutrality are currently still at the demonstration stage. The IEA has written a report that says that most of the reductions in CO2 emissions through 2030 come from technologies that are already on the market today, but in 2050, almost half of the reduction should come from technologies that are still at the demonstration or prototype phase at the moment. So we have to do major innovation efforts to do this decade in any case, to bring these new technologies to the market in time. Now, to do this or to help support this, last year the Commission published a Green Deal call that was dedicated to the specific objectives of the climate mitigation, clean energy and sustainable development under the Green Deal. That was the last call in Horizon 2020, where we invested a total of 1 billion euros in 73 projects. And the bulk of this funding and these projects is going to projects in the energy, the buildings and the mobility sector. This conference that we're starting today will discuss energy system modeling to support some of the key building blocks of that Green Deal. For example, hydrogen, offshore renewable energy, and the building sector. Those will be sessions for tomorrow. And of course, the overarching issue of energy system integration, which is very important as well. Energy system integration relies on a very much coordinated planning and operation of energy systems as a whole across multiple energy carriers, infrastructures and consumption sectors, end-use sectors. It's therefore a key element of sustainable development. Sustainable development in itself means that we must improve the quality of our energy system. And that means quality not just in terms of technical issues, but also in terms of economic and environmental performance. If you take the example of offshore renewable energy, this will only be sustainable if it does not have any negative impacts on the environment, as well as on economic, social, and territorial cohesion. And when you look at the EU's steeply rising offshore renewable energy capacity, that we're scaling it up rapidly at the moment, we must use all the best available modeling tools to monitor potential impacts on the marine environment, but also on other economic activities such as fisheries. In the building sector, if we look there, modeling is also gaining ground. For example, if you use modeling during a pre-construction phase or a pre-design phase even, a building can achieve up to 45% energy savings. And in the EU's Renovation Wave strategy that was published last year as part of the Green Deal, the Commission announced that it will provide a recommendation to promote building information modeling in public procurement for construction. If we now go to the Horizon Europe Work Programme 2021-2022, I'll try to be as brief as I can. This was adopted in June this year. And in that work program, cluster 5 is where this is of interest to you as an audience. This will address climate, energy, and transport as one cluster. And this work program will contain, or does contain, several topics where modeling is a major component. For example, to model the potential contribution of the circular economy in Europe to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Advanced modeling tools to perform regional and cross-border energy system planning on a long time horizon that can also include cross-sectoral disruptive innovations in industry, in mobility, and in the building sector. Then we have a specific topic on energy system modeling for the African Union. Today, African countries are relying almost entirely on energy models and expertise from developed countries. And this topic, therefore, will specifically address the development of models tailored to the specific African social, economic, and regulatory environment. Then we will support the development of modeling tools to analyze the impacts of wind installations on the environment and on local communities. And we also will support the development of improved integrated digital solutions that can support the stakeholders involved in the different phases of building construction or renovation processes. So I think these topics in the new work program of Horizon Europe clearly underline the importance of modeling in supporting the European Green Deal. And the work program therefore provides an excellent opportunity for all of you to collaborate on these topics. And I can only strongly encourage you to respond to these calls, and I would welcome you to do so. So with this, I wish you many interesting and fruitful discussions over the next 3 days, and looking forward to your discussions. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeroen. I want to then turn over to our next speaker, who is from the International Energy Agency and is Stephanie Bouchardt. Stephanie?
Pardon, there was a second speak from the Commission, no?
Yeah, there's a
Oh,
second from Commission.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If I may.
I'm very sorry. Sorry, Miguel Tercha. I'm very sorry. Yeah,
No,
I missed that in my list here.
No, Stephanie, my apologies.
Yes, excuse me.
Yeah. No,
Please go
excuse
ahead.
me, and excuse me, Stephanie, please. But I will make it short. Thank you very much for giving DGNR the opportunity to say a very few words. Of course, Jeroen has, from our research and development, has already said most that should be said, but I would like to add a very few things. So first of all, I would want to congratulate the organizers for having mobilized the resources to make this 5th edition of the European Modeling Platform possible. And as you know, the Director General for Energy has been involved in these events since the beginning. And we are also, let's say, one of the main clients of what comes out of those, both the activities and the conferences, I would argue, because the modeling is actually, and modeling tools are crucial for our policy decision making. As you know, this summer we published delivering the European Green Deal package with 14 legislative proposals, not all from energy, in the field of energy, but in several fields. And all those were underpinned by thorough analysis. And this thorough analysis involves modeling, involves quantitative parts, and those quantitative parts of impact assessment are done with mathematical tools, which assess policies' effectiveness and evaluate the potential consequences of our proposals. Model-based analysis is used for understanding the future, but occasionally can also help understanding the current situation, as for instance, the high prices we witness now. I think most of the participants are familiar with some of our standard products, such as a reference scenario and the Green Deal scenarios that we published for underpinning the current proposals, and that are published on our website for you to know. Such scenarios require models, of course. They require actually a suite of models, because the analysis you perform stretches from macroeconomics to environmental impacts. Many of the projects involved know that very well. The modeling exercises at the Commission involve colleagues from many different policy directorates working together in order to provide the best advice that we want to offer. So that, and they also include consultations with member states, stakeholders, and in order to ensure the relevance of our results. If you look at the analysis we did this time, we look at a number of core scenarios that reflect complementarity options for achieving the increased ambitions, the increased greenhouse gas ambition for 2030. Again, I said you can study the results on the website, and you can also download the reference scenario. In order to perform our analysis at DGNR, we keep investing in tools and knowledge. And we do that both with the help of contractors. So many modelers also present today are responding to calls for specific studies we issue. We keep investing in this and help you investing in it. And we also develop our in-house competence in the form of the Joint Research Center, because in-house competence can be important in a market with very highly specialized products, very few players, and sometimes a rapidly varying workload. We are well aware that modeling itself is subject of research and development. And we know that we need these developments because the challenges, as we have just learned, will keep modelers busy for 30 years. And we understand that models will need to be improved. So to follow the technological development and follow the questions that will come along the transition. So for that reason, we need and we welcome the development and the effort that the modeling community is putting into developing ever more relevant, more sophisticated and complex models. And this is why we supported the energy modeling platform from the start. Thanks, of course, to RTD for organizing that and kicking it off. We believe the format is now mature, established, and I believe it has become a success. And while we were always convinced that such a conference would have a potential and that there's a need of that for this European conference, because there was none before, none of what we see today would ever have been possible without the dedication and hard work of those who organize it. So thank you very much in the name of DGN for this, for the organizers and for the participants who are actively engaging in discussions and making this conference a success. We will be able to profit from this rich 3-day conference, which has an excellent program, so to which DGN will warmly welcome you, and we hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for giving me these 5 minutes.
And thank you very much, Andreas. And I apologize for skipping over you. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next panelist, which is now Stephanie from IEA. Are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you see my slide?
Great. Yes, we see it perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. First, thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me to this great event. And good morning, everyone. With my presentation, I'd like to give a bit of the key insights of the World Energy Outlook 2021 that we have just published 2 weeks ago, and that is meant to be a handbook guide for the COP. Really linked to what you have mentioned at the beginning. So first, let me start with a bit of context. So as you have said, COP26 will start now in less than a week. And during the year, and even more during the last weeks, we have seen a lot of announcements made by countries, either on achieving net zero CO2 emissions by a certain date, or net zero greenhouse gas emissions by a certain date, or strengthening their ambition for 2030 to achieve such a target. And more recently, we are experiencing high volatility on energy markets, especially for natural gas in Europe. During the years, we have also witnessed some severe weather events, notably important floodings in Germany and Belgium in July. There are also some good news, as we saw that during the pandemic, clean technologies such as solar, PV and wind, and also electric vehicles proved to be resilient. Unfortunately, we also some other bad news. We saw that in the past years, improvements in energy access was increasing. We saw that the number of people without access to electricity declined by an average 9% per year, but progress has clearly stalled between 2019 and 2021. So within our report, within the World Energy Outlook 2021, we explore the transformation of the energy sector following 3 different scenarios. So the first one that you may be familiar with is called STEPS, for stated policy scenarios, and which aims to show us where the world is heading to with the current policy environment. The second scenario called APS. So first one, we have introduced such a scenario in the WEO. This APS is for announced pledges scenarios and shows us where we might go if all countries meet their announced pledges in full. So making sure that all these pledges are backed up by specific measures and policies. And we compare these two scenarios with the net zero by 2050 scenarios that we have presented in the net zero roadmap that we have published in May, and that was mentioned in the previous discussion. So with all that context, let me start with the CO2 emissions and how it may look like at the global level. So over the last 2 decades, we have seen that global CO2 emissions were rising continuously, and cumulative emissions since pre-industrial times have already warmed the Earth by more than 1 degree. Looking back at our baseline in the Rio before the Paris Climate Summit, we were seeing continued emission growth out to 2050, and this would have lead us to a catastrophic level of warming of around 3.5 degrees in 2100. So now with the new policy environment, with the technology cost reduction, but also due to the economic impact of the pandemic, we see a very different picture emerging in the energy sector. So in the steps, we see now a near-term peak in global emissions, and after that, a slow decline. But clearly, this is not enough and far from the goals of the Paris Agreement, because the steps would lead us to 2100 warming of 2.6 degrees Celsius. As I mentioned in the beginning, and as it was mentioned already in previous by previous speakers, in the last year or so, we have seen countries announcing net zero targets. So countries accounting for up to 70% of global emissions have already announced net zero targets, and around 120 countries have submitted new or updated 2030 NDCs, and these account for more than half of global emissions. These new policy ambitions and net zero pledges have been incorporated in the EPS, as I have said, and if these are met in full, this would lead for the first time to a substantial change in terms of emissions pathway compared to the steps, with a peak in the mid-2020s and then a steady decline. What does that mean for the energy markets? So in the case of the steps, if we keep the current policy environment, we see that oil demand exceeds soon the 2019 levels, the level before the pandemic, that natural gas is 15% higher in 2030 compared to today's level. And solar PV and wind expansion means that these two sources meet 3/4 of electricity demand growth. So basically, we see that the next decade will look pretty similar to the one we had before. But already with the announced pledges, we see quite some changes. We see oil peaking by 2025, notably due to a reverse of trend of oil use for cars. And this is clearly linked to the 34 countries up to now that have announced that they will stop ICE sales by a certain date. For natural gas, we see a peak just after 2025, with the important reduction stemming from the power sector due to the increase of renewables, but also coming from the building sectors thanks to more efficient buildings and a switch to electricity. And in the case of solar PV and wind, they continue their further expansion, meeting all the electricity demand growth by 2030. And we will see then annual capacity additions reaching almost 500 gigawatts by 2030. So if we take again a step back, in 1990, the share of fossil fuel was 81%. 30 years after, so today, big news, this share has dropped to 79%. So only 2 percentage points lower, but already in the case of the APS, we will observe an important change, as in the next decade, so by 2030, this share will drop to close to 70%. I have mentioned oil, I have mentioned gas, renewables, but what about coal, which is the source of over 40% of all energy-related CO2 emissions in 2020, and when one sector in particular being a major emitter, which is the power sector. So if we look only at the power sector, coal-fired power plants account for about 30% of global energy-related emissions in 2020, which makes them really at the forefront to address climate change and making sure that we need to address how to phase out these kind of power plants to put us on a pathway towards net zero by 2050. So really the first task in phasing out coal emissions will be to stop construction of new coal-fired power plants. However, as you can see on the figure, during this decade, we have observed new records in terms of coal-fired capacity additions. And looking forward, so in the case of the APS, announced pledges will cancel about 20% of planned plants. But we'll still see 350 gigawatts being built in the 3 next decades. But of course, there are opportunities to move the needle. And for example, we have heard at the UN General Assembly that in September that China has now the intention to stop supporting new coal power plants abroad. And this could cancel up to 190 gigawatts of new plants over the next 30 years and could reduce related CO2 emissions, so cumulative CO2 emissions, by about 20 gigatons to 2050. If this intention is really fully realized, then this decade could be the last with new unabated coal-fired power plants. Of course, this will solve only part of the issue, as we will still have the current fleet of coal power plants, and those will still emit CO2 for years. But there are ways to cut emissions from these, but still they need to be implemented. So if we come back to CO2 emissions, despite the progress that we see in the APS, there is still a substantial gap to the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, because the APS will lead us to a temperature increase of 2.1 degrees by the end of the century. And this gap in terms of CO2 emission is very important in the short term, so to 2030. In 2030, the APS close only 20% of the gap between the steps, so between the stated policy scenario and the net zero scenario. So leaving us with an ambition gap of some 14 gigaton of CO2 equivalent. And in our analysis, we have seen that countries with pledges account for half of that gap, and countries without any net zero pledges are responsible for the remaining half between the APS and the net zero. So this clearly indicates that all countries need to step up their ambition if we want to close that gap, if we want to put the world on a pathway towards net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And we are left with that ambition gap of 14 gigaton of CO2 equivalents in 2030 to put the world on the net zero emissions pathway. But the good news is that we have the policies and technologies to close that gap. So for this World Energy Outlook, we have looked sector by sector, region by region, looking at all the technologies that we have at hand, and what share of the ambition gap, announced pledges scenario and the NZD could be closed cost effectively. So how many additional EVs, how many additional wind and solar PV we can deploy, how many additional or efficient appliances, for example, without increasing the total ownership costs for consumers. And we have found that more than 40% of that ambition gap, so of the 14 gigaton of CO2 equivalent gap that we have between the APS and the NZD could be closed by cost-effective technologies, of course, as long as policymakers put in place the right enabling conditions. So the electricity sector could deliver around half of these additional cost-effective reductions, mostly with additional solar PV and wind. And solar PV and wind capacity additions in that case would reach 800 gigawatts in 2030, so up from the nearly 500 gigawatts that we have in the APS. Other measures in the power sector also include hydropower expansion, nuclear lifetime extension. Another key area is to reduce fossil fuel methane leaks. This is clearly another critical measure. Today, we continue to release an important amount of methane directly in the atmosphere, even though methane is an important greenhouse gas. And demand sectors could play also an important role in closing the gap, with additional electric cars being added to the global fleet over the next decade, and this with no cost for consumers, but also with additional use of more efficient appliances, more efficient air conditioners, more efficient light bulbs, more efficient industrial motors, or even more efficient trucks. What about the remaining 60% of reductions? Here we take also into account additional measures to reduce demand, such as material efficiency in the industry sector or behavior measures in the buildings and transport sectors, but also other measures that are not cost effective by 2030, but with an important share that could be cost effective by 2050. So I'm referring here to hydrogen, to CCUS, to advanced biofuels. And we need clearly early actions for those to make sure that these technologies are available on time to put the world on a path towards net zero by 2050. So to conclude, the scale of the changes required in the energy system are huge, but we still have a reason to remain optimistic. The pathway to keep the door to 1.5 degrees open is narrow, but as our executive director said, it's still achievable. In the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of announcements, a lot of pledges. Now, just let's walk the talk and enter the decade of actions, implementing policies to meet announced pledge and raising ambitions in line with the net zero target. There's now just no time to waste. Thanks a lot for your attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Stephanie, thank you so much. I found that incredibly interesting. I want to ask if there are any questions out there using the Q&A function. We haven't received any so far, but if people do want to type in a question to you or either of our previous two speakers, please do so now. And if we don't get anything in the next minute, I'm just going to turn over, then I'm going to open the first plenary session. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much then. So we're going to open this conference now. I've really enjoyed these first three talks. I am going to start us right off. We're going to move straight into the first plenary session, which is plenary 1 on policies and targets. So I'm Anthony Pat, and along with Stefan Fenninger, I'm co-chairing this session. I want to remind people to please type questions during the talks in the Q&A, not future, but feature of Zoom. And this should be in your toolbar down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we have 4 talks for this session. The first is going to be Henrik Lund from Aalborg University on the modeling of strategies for a fully decarbonized society, followed by Robert Pietzke from PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, achieving the EU 2030 targets, what level of carbon prices and enabling policies are needed. Then Rafael Garrafa from the JRC in Seville, towards a net zero emission world, the Global Energy and Climate Outlook 2021, And finally, Diana Urj-Forzats from Central European University, latest insights on why energy modeling is necessary in the context of EU climate neutral targets and how energy models are used in policymaking. And I do have one note. Unfortunately, Diana is sick and we have a pre-recorded talk of hers. It went a little bit over time. And so what we're going to do is we're only going to show that recording if in fact we're well under time from the first three speakers. If it seems like the talks are going their full length or a little longer, and their questions and answers, we're going to skip the final talk because unfortunately Diana is sick, and just skip with those first three. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn over to our first speaker, who is Henrik Lund. Henrik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to share my screen here. See if that works. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, looks fine.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity at this conference here to talk about the title of the presentation, the modeling of strategies for a fully decarbonized society. What I will try to do here is talk about this concept of the fully decarbonized society, or net zero, as we just heard it, or climate neutral. It has many words right now, but what is really on the political agenda now, as we just heard here in the introduction speeches before, and what this means to how we as modelers, how we should develop our models, and also how we should use our models in order to provide good information for how we could achieve such transformation. And I will take a little benefit from that I have been doing modeling, both developed model and also used models for many years now. Actually, I started back when I was a student and did my master already in the early 1980s. I did modeling. I made a master thesis of modeling a green island, the green island of Bornholm. That was a project in those days. And I will sort of say a little bit about how we used to do modeling and have been doing modeling throughout many years, and what now the demand for models is, and if our models are equipped for that, and how we should consider to reorganize and redesign our models in order to give good input and good solutions to the transformation that we have defined politically right now. I'll just start out with this. This is a scenario from the report, A Clean Planet. We also heard about the other one, the Green Deal, and so on, just in the previous talks and so on. But I would just like to emphasize here is the word climate neutral. We also heard it was mentioned net zero. But basically, this is what we talk about right now in our society. This is to go to become climate neutral. And of course, this involves a lot of things, not only energy modeling, but also that we need to align our energy modeling with decarbonization and so on in other sectors, and even sinks and CCS and biochars and so on. And that's what I'll try to address right now. And as I mentioned, this is not how it used to be when I was a student. Then we talked about renewable energy, and we also talked about, you can say we talked a little bit about green transition. As I mentioned, the island we were doing at that time was called Bornholm, becoming a green island. But basically we talked about something else. Now, no matter if we talk about becoming a 100% renewable energy or the climate neutral economy or whatever we talk about it, then what we do as modelers, and both when we develop the model and when we use them, that is try to answer the question, how can we do this? How can we do this in an affordable and doable way? And that's what I think is essential for the models here. Try to design the investments we need to do and design them in a way so we can actually do it and make use of the best the technologies we have, identify the technologies that we need to develop, identify what the role of those technologies would be in the overall perspective of the system. This is how I see our role. And it's not only a matter of then having good tools and models that we can use, but it's also a matter of discussing what the methodology of use of them is and how we should use them. What I'll try a little bit here is talk about some of the trends that I have seen, and that is going from the integration of wind and then into 100% renewable energy systems. That we also talked about being smart, going from smart grid to what I promote as the more coherent smart energy systems approach. Also going from now smart energy systems into decarbonized societies. And also I will elaborate a little bit on when we use our models, it's not only a matter of calculating the world or Europe. By the end of the day, it will be some local communities, cities or municipalities or countries that will have to start acting and implementing. And how can we use the models and what type of methodology should we apply if a municipality or city or country would like to develop a strategy on how they can contribute the best into this transformation here. I just been to a conference in Dubrovnik where they, for many years, starting in 2002, we have been discussing not only energy, but also environmental and border systems modeling and tools and so on. And when I made an introductory note there, I put forward, and I'll also show them here some older slides. This is a slides from when we debated these topics in 2005. And yes, you can see here, we call it sustainable energy development. And the focus was on savings and energy efficiency and renewable energy and flexible technologies. And the focus also here were very much on, you can say, the electricity supply. And that is very often where models have started, because we have this issue of the wind turbines and the PV coming in and the electricity demand and so on. But very soon, when you have this type of models, you realize that, well, we'll also have some electric cars, and we'll also have some heat pumps, and there are also some combined heat and power. So you need to include also the heating and also the transport. And this is just some slides for some years later on at the same conference, where we then started to discussing the 100% renewable energy systems, how to put together that it is all the system, including the transport and so on, that we have to model, and also then how to identify the best solutions when we did that, also to develop the tools so we in fact could identify the best solutions. I'll come a little bit back to that. But before that, I will talk a little bit about being smart, because at a certain year, we started to talk a lot about a smart grid, and I, at a certain point, look back, where did this expression came from. And as far as I can see, the first mention of smart grid was in this paper here in 2005. And the whole idea about the paper was to say that within power networks, why not make use of, now we have invented the computer, why not be more smart, both in terms of electricity demand, electricity distribution, electricity production, and so on. And out of that, the expression smart grid came. it was never really defined as a scientific expression, but it was defined later because a number of funding units, the US DOE and also in Europe and so on, started to fund money for developing smart grids, and then they had to define it. And what came out of this definition and also the origin of smart grid was a very focus on the power sector, on the electricity sector. It was being smart, but it was being smart mostly with a sole focus on the electricity sector. For that reason, I and also a lot of others started to discussing, and also in European documents, you can see why not being smart in other grids as well, district heating grids and so on. And for that reason, we defined this smart electricity grid, smart thermal grid, and smart gas grids. You can actually be smart in many grids, and of course we should do that if we wish to identify the doable and best solution. But really to be really smart is when we take the holistic approach and the sector integration and do this, and then we have been promoting the expression smart energy systems as a way of expressing that we are not only smart within the individual grids and sectors, but we are smart across the sectors. And it's when we do this coordinated action between the sectors that we can really identify the best and the most doable solutions. We can also illustrate it in this picture that is just one illustration of how we have the many grids, and it's when we take this holistic approach, we can identify the best solutions. You can say the whole idea of smart energy systems is a little bit a mini theory, sort of saying that we can go to 100% renewable energy systems or fully decarbonized societies, for that matter, in many ways. But if we wish to identify the doable and the most affordable ways of doing this, then we should take an integrated approach, because you cannot find the best solution if you look only at each sector one by one. It's when they collaborate that you can identify the very best solutions. Now, this have actually gained a momentum in the literature. So we measured in a review paper some years ago how this expression have entered the scene, and also sort of entered the way that we think how we should model it, and for that reason also the tools that we develop in order to do that. I'll just mention a few arguments why taking this integrated approach is essential. And the one important thing is that the cost of energy storage is very, very different depending on what type of energy you wish to store. And in this diagram here, I just compared the electricity storage with heat storage and gas and liquid fuel storage. And then electricity storage are here defined as something where we have a surplus of wind or PV at 1 hour and we want to store it. So we put in some electricity, and then in another hour where we have a lack of wind and solar, then we wish to take it out again. So it's electricity where we put electricity in and take electricity out. That's how I defined an electricity storage. And that, of course, could be many different technologies. Could be batteries or pumped hydro storage, as illustrated here. It could also be converting to hydrogen and back again, and so on and so forth. That could be many different technologies, as we all know. But common for all these technologies are that they are very costly. They cost a lot of money compared to a thermal storage that could be a heat storage, illustrated here to the upper right. That is a tank from a Danish CHP plant, a tank of water. And that is in the order of magnitude 100 times more affordable than an electricity storage. Natural gas or gas storage is 10 times even more affordable, and a liquid storage is 10 times more affordable. So for that reason, if we can design our systems not looking at electricity on its own and corner ourselves into solutions with electricity storage to be needed. But if we can integrate the system so that we can store the energy as heat or gas or liquid fuel, then it becomes so much more affordable to really store the enormous amounts of energy that we'll have from wind and PV in the future if we should decarbonize the societies. Another argument is, if you look at the storage, this is the energy storage capacity in Denmark. You can see the biggest storage capacity we have is the oil tanks. Then we have a big gas storage, and then we have some thermal storage. And this is where I have added up all the individual water supply tanks, hot water tanks in all the houses, plus all the thermal storage capacity we have in our CHP plants, plus also some new we have in seasonal storage of solar thermal and so on. And as you can see, it's quite small compared to the storage capacity we have in the other storage. I have not put in the electricity storage here because that is so small you couldn't see it on the diagram. But a major point I'll try to make here is that when we analyze how to go into 100% renewable energy using this smart energy approach and sort of doing it in an integrating way so that we can convert wind via heat pumps into heat and via power to X into gas and liquid fuel and so on and so forth, and have a focus on this in an integrated way, then we will actually be able to, in the Danish case, to convert to 100% renewable energy using only this storage here. And as you can see, it was more or less the storage we already have. We need to add some. In this case, this is one scenario. There can be others, but they can look more like this one. But we have to add some hydrogen storage. We also have to expand the thermal storage, and of course, we should have some electricity storage in all the electric vehicles and so on, in order to transport the electricity so they can move. And by doing this, of course, we could also make some smart charging. But you can see here. What is shown here is actually if all Danish cars were converted into electric vehicles, and so it's not a huge storage compared to what we have. But the idea, the main point here, if we take this integrated approach, then we can design systems that can do with storage that is affordable. We don't have to corner ourselves into a solution in which we have to overinvest in very, very expensive electricity storage system. Another important thing is that we already have some grid and in Denmark and not in other countries either in Europe, the electricity grid is the place where we distribute the most energy. Here I compared the Danish natural gas and district heating and electricity grid compared on the peak hour. And as you can see, the capacity of the district heating grid and natural gas grid are so much higher than the electricity grid. And this is also one of the things taking the smart energy systems approach, that is to try to make use of all the grids we already have and then expand them in a coordinated manner so that we can we don't have to for example, if we should distribute everything within the electricity sector and everything's what's electric heating and so on, then we had to expand the electricity grid enormously. One of the things that I also find very important is that the heating sector, very often, both in the modeling and the methodologies and the scenarios we have seen, the heating sector is not looked into very carefully. We have made quite some analysis on how the heating sector, and there are enormously energy efficiency measures to be achieved if we include district heating and also develop the district heating into low temperature. We have promoted that under the concept of fourth generation district heating as illustrated here. And in the future systems, there will be a lot of excess heat, not only from industry, but also from, for example, data centers, power to X, and so on and so forth, that we can utilize if we have district heating, and we can utilize it in a very efficient way if it's low temperature district heating. We have made some studies about that using our tools and models that we have called Heat Roadmap Europe, that have tried to put on the European agenda how much more affordable and also how much more energy efficient we could have our complete energy system in Europe if we included more district heating and recycled the excess heat, both in terms of money and in terms of energy efficiency and lack on the pressure of imported gas as it is right now, but on how many wind turbines and PV we have to build in the future. This is really important. Now I'll turn my head a little bit to look at the modeling. There are a lot of models out there. In Aalborg University, we use the model we have designed called Energy Plan. We have provided this as a freeware tool for many years now. I think the last 20 years or something like that, and also developing on a running basis. And we have a lot of users around in the world that use the models. Also, a lot of universities use it for teaching and so on and so forth. And for that reason, we also get a lot of feedback from the users. Couldn't you do this and that? And we try to do our best to make this model always good for making this type of analysis that is required. And the reflection as it has been up to now is that taking this smart energy systems approach, it is essential for us to develop our tool and model so that we can calculate not only the electricity sector, but also district heating and the gas and all the sectors. And also not only looking at how to store energy within the individual sector, but also have a very strong focus on how we can convert energy between the sectors, and also how we can model this on an hourly basis, so we can really play with if we have this type of conversion unit, power to X or electrolyzers or heat pumps or whatever, and this type of grid, how can we then store the energy where and for how long and what type of storage do we need? And we think this type of designing your tool is essential if you wish to identify solution, as I just illustrated here, where we can actually convert to 100% renewable energy in an affordable and doable way. And this is how we have designed the tool up till now. And we have applied that on the European scale. For example, this paper here on smart energy Europe. We also applied the same tool to on the city level. This is from Aalborg, where of course I live myself. We have made some visions for the municipality of Aalborg and designed how Aalborg could become 100% renewable energy in 2050 and also fully decarbonized. And this is also with the type of tool here, because and we can do this without forcing ourselves to invest a lot of money in storage and infrastructures and so on. We also used the tool and the analysis to emphasize how important it is to be energy efficient. And you can be energy efficient in several ways. Of course, you can save energy. For example, here where we look at the heating, you can save energy by renovating your buildings and so on. But you can also be inefficient in the distribution, for example, having more district heating and recycling more of excess heat and so on. And I will not go into the details of these numbers, but just say that here we compare some different scenarios. And one of the extremes is the smart energy scenario, in which we have a lot of district heating in Denmark and individual heat pumps outside the reach of the district heating grids, and then we can recycle a lot of that is to the lower right side with savings and with and without savings. And we also compared that to individual heat pumps and also to electric heating. And just to mention, between the extreme of having saving and doing the smart energy, or the other extreme, that is having electric heating on all houses and not doing savings, then there is in the order of magnitude a factor 10 between how many wind turbines we have to build in Denmark in order to heat all the buildings in Denmark. And now, when I made this study here, I didn't imagine that anyone would suggest to make hydrogen and then burn hydrogen in boilers. But if you include that solution also in the diagram here, then the factor would be maybe more like 20 than 10. And this is just to emphasize that energy efficiency and how to design your system is essential. And for that reason, of course, you also need tools and models to be able to do that. One of the points out of this study here is also that one thing is that you have to build many more wind turbines, and that will cost a lot of money, of course. But the other thing is that you also have to expand your electricity grid. In our calculation, in the Danish case, that will cost even more money. But what is also important is that if you do an electricity heating, then you cannot store your heat as a thermal heat. That will be either cost a lot of thermal storage, or it will cost a lot of electricity storage to make this work, and that is even more costly than expanding the grid. So the whole infrastructure consequence of choosing between these scenarios in terms of grid and storage is even more costly than the wind turbines themselves. And this is just to say why it is so incredibly important in order to be able to look into these details with the way we design our scenarios and also the way that we model them. Now I'll come back to a little bit to what I started with, namely how can we then model the challenge we have now, that is not only smart energy systems and 100% renewable energy, but it's also to look at that within the overall target of a net zero or climate neutral societies for the future. And this here is just to illustrate, if you take the Danish case, then the energy and transport is here illustrated. This is the Danish carbon dioxide emissions from 1990 and until now, and then a proposal on how it could be in 2030. And the dark blue to the bottom of all the diagram here is energy and transport. But then there are also other sectors, agriculture and processes, industry, and also the area and so on. And when we do this, then we have to look upon all these sectors in a coherency. And when we do this for one country or a city or something, then we have developed an overall, you could say, guideline. And when we did a study for this for Denmark. And that is, what is it we should do in Denmark? Is it just that we should become climate neutral? Because we can do that in many ways. We could import biofuels from Brazil, or we could build a lot of wind turbines and then just export it and say we are net zero and so on. But what we try to define here is, no, if it should make any sense, and we should all do this by the end of the day, then the single country, in this case Denmark, we should fulfill our objectives of carbon dioxide reductions in a way so it fits well into a context in which the rest of Europe, and by the end of the day, the rest of the world, will do the same. And this is a very good overall guiding principle to have, and then you can elaborate it on it. For example, in Denmark, if we look upon our targets, it's defined in accordance with the UN way of calculating carbon dioxide emissions, but the UN way of calculating for an individual country does not include international aviation and shipping. And we have to deal with that one way or another. So that's also something we should deal with our share in Denmark when we design our way of becoming decarbonized. There's also not an infinite amount of sustainable use of biomass. So we should also in the Danish design limit ourselves to our share for the sustainable biomass. And also by the end of the day, we have to make the electricity grid and the gas and heating grids of Europe be balanced on an hourly basis. So we should also, in the design of the Danish system, we should also contribute with our share of flexibility. Not that we should not trade between one another. Of course, there'll be mutual benefit of doing this, but we can not just sell anything surplus and expect to buy when the wind is not blowing. We have to provide our share of the flexibility. And this is how we have then, this is sort of the overall guideline when we design this type of scenarios. And for example, we have then been looking into what is our carbon dioxide emission, not only the way we do it in the UN accounting system, but also if we start to include our share of international shipping and aviation. And also, for example, if we import, as we do right now in Denmark, and maybe we shouldn't, biomass from other countries, then there's also carbon dioxide linked to that is then accounted for in the other countries. But maybe that is also something we should take into consideration when we do this. And based on these principles, we have then designed a proposal for how Denmark could become fully decarbonized in not 2050, because we have a debate in Denmark, couldn't we do it a little earlier? So now we are trying to make a proposal saying 2045 instead of 2050. And maybe then as time goes, maybe we can do it even earlier than that. But here just illustrated that when we look upon the analysis of energy systems, smart energy systems and transport systems and so on, but we look upon it in the context of a fully decarbonized goal, then as far as we can analyze it and see it, it will be very, very difficult in Denmark to have the agricultural going to zero, to net zero on its own. There will still be something from that and some of the industrial processes and so on that we will have to compensate for. We can do it within the energy, the burning of fossil fuels, we can replace that and so, but we have to make some kind of compensation and think in terms of carbon capture and storage or biochar. We have both included here in this scenario. And for that reason, the output of our system looks like this. This is a proposal for 2045 and accounted for hour by hour for all sectors and all storages and how they are filled and emptied and so on and so forth for in this case the Danish society. But I'll try to emphasize here as a last point is that in order to do this from a modeling point of view, then the biomass become incredibly important, and also the sources for CCS, and also the whole idea of how we should convert the biomass, and also how we should choose between if we should use the biomass for liquid and gaseous fuels to, for example, cover the share of aviation and shipping and so on, or we should maybe make biochar out of it to provide a sink for the, and also the whole issue on if we say at the global level, we should stick within the limits of sustainable biomass. And as a consequence, we in Denmark say we should stick within our share of that. Then we should also say, all of us, that we should also try to develop so that we get as much sustainable biomass out of our countries as possible. So here we also lead an active strategy in developing a biomass conversion technology, so we can get a lot of residual, for example, straws in Denmark, but we also have a lot of organic waste and so on in biogas plants and so on and so forth. What we also have a focus on here is that the different technologies, pyrolysis, thermal gasification, biogas, and so on, they have products that they cannot convert, but maybe some of the other technologies can convert them. For example, if you put straws into a biogas plant, not all of it can be fermented, but some of the excess products can be put into pyrolysis and the other way around, and HTL and so on and so forth. So, and then you can also quantify your sources, your point sources for carbon capturing, both for what you like to do as electrofuels and the CCU, and also those that you'll try to do for CCS. And that's what we did in the study I just mentioned there. And just as a final reflection here before I stop is that a model like the one we are using for this, then it became urgent, and this is where we have had a focus on expanding our model, not only on the hydrogen side that we have included for many years, but also on the whole biomass conversion with technologies as HTL and pyrolysis and biogas and gasification and many more. This is only showing some of them, and also how they interact and how we can do the whole carbon calculation out of this, and we could do it in a way so that we can actually calculate hour by hour how the different technologies are operating in the system. This is my reflection. I only have one slide here where you can have more information about some of the things I have been speaking about here. And with that, then I think I'll stop sharing and give the word back to you, Tony. Maybe you can head if there are any questions or something we should discuss.
Thank you very much, Henrik. That was really interesting. A few questions have popped up onto the Q&A function of the chat, and what I'm going to ask is that that you and the other panelists type the answers to the questions, and then at the end of the session we'll have a discussion of the themes that have come out of the Q&A. So I want to thank you. A couple questions have already come in. If Henrik, you could respond to those typing, and then we'll come back to them later at the end. So one important announcement: we've made the decision that Diana's talk will actually be moved to the poster session. We're not going to have it now, which frees up more time for the speakers now and for Q&A at the end. So with that, I want to introduce our next speaker, who's Robert Pietzke from PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, on achieving the EU 2030 targets and the policies and enabling prices and policies that we need. Okay, over to you, Robert.
Hello, everyone. I hope this works. And you see my slides.
It is working. We see your slides just perfectly.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to introduce the work of our group at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. This was funded by the EU Commission in the InnoPath project and is now being taken over by the European Climate and Energy Modeling Forum, which just started recently, and also by the German Ministry for Research. So if we look at the 2030 target and the 2050 target, the EU Green Deal, The billion-dollar question is, how can we achieve the EU Green Deal? Let me first remind you how ambitious these targets are. Really, if we look at the targets, minus 55% reduction versus 1990, that means from now, a 40% emission reduction in 9 years. That is tomorrow. Secondly, if we look out a bit further, greenhouse gas neutrality in less than 30 years, if we contrast that with the lifetime of many technologies, which is larger than 25 years, this means really any new investment into fossil technologies may risk the 2050 target. This is very ambitious, or to quote Franz Timmermann, it is going to be bloody hard to do. Still, there are very, very good reasons why we should try to do it. So let's look at what policies and measures can bring us there. Before we go into the details, I'll say that working on this task, and especially for Germany now with a 2045 timeline, these very ambitious timelines, these really raise fundamental questions, especially to fellow economists like myself, because it puts out two key questions. How much does this short timeline shift the focus from economic efficiency, which we usually say is sort of one of the highest goals, to effectiveness and robustness, to getting us there? And connected to this, when is it better to make a suboptimal choice rather than leaving all options open, waiting for better information, but thereby risk that we slow the transformation because we're unsure and everybody else is unsure how to act? So going from this meta level down into the actual modeling and the actual questions we looked at, if we have a new overall target, how do we break it down? Well, I would say there are many aspects of the EU climate policy, but two key pillars: the EU ETS covering electricity and large industry, and the effort sharing regulation giving targets for transport, buildings, agriculture, and small industry. Now, we had an old target, and if we have a newer target that is tighter, namely minus 55%, which means roughly 700 megatons CO2 equivalents that we have to reduce on top of it was before, we need to have new sub-targets. And we can either put these reductions, bring them in the ESR, so make the national member state contributions tighter, or put them into the ETS. The Fit for 55 proposal said we'll take 40% reductions in the ESR and 61% in the ETS. And clearly the question that arises from this is, what does such a cap in the ETS mean for the power sector? And similar, what does the ESR target mean for the ESR sectors? Now, on the first part, we published a paper in April this year, where we looked at this in detail with a detailed power sector industry model called LIMES EU. And we find that the tighter ETS caps proposed by the Commission have a very large impact on carbon prices. Now, I'll have several of these plots. So to briefly explain, you always see the next 35 years, next 30 years down here, and then either prices or emissions or some other quantity here. In black, that's always the modeling run or the scenario with the old targets. In green, the scenario with a new Fit for 55 targets. And we see directly CO2 prices in the ETS would more than triple from before roughly 35 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030 to around 130 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030. And clearly this will drive down emissions from electricity generation even before they went down substantially, but now we reach net neutrality before 2040. How does this come about? Well, if we look at the power sector, these carbon prices above 100 euros per ton of CO2, they fundamentally transform the power sector. I show you here generation in the EU in 2050. You have nuclear here in pink, then you have fossils, lignite, hard coal gas, and then some renewables. If you look out to 2020, bottom didn't change much, but some wind and PV was added. Now, if we look out what the new EU ETS targets will do to a cost optimal evolving system, we find a fundamental transformation. So in the long run, our scenarios tell us the most cost efficient way is to base the EU power sector almost exclusively on renewables, mostly wind and solar here, tiny bit of biomass. Now, if we look to the shorter term, 2030, we see renewables making up already more than 70%, which requires very, very large investments because we're talking about these 9 years. So more than 50 gigawatt per year PV, more than 30 30 gigawatt per year wind, some hydrogen, some batteries. And fossil fuels are strongly reduced already by 2030. If we look in more detail into this, how this phase out of fossil fuels use in power is going on. This shows you electricity generation from coal from the historic 2015 value. And we see with a new target, the green line, already in 2030, we have an EU-wide coal phase out. So there's 20 terawatt hours, it's not complete, but it's almost a complete phase out. And if we look at gas, it's also going down quite significantly. So we are at less than 50% compared to 2015 gas use. Now, this is just looking at the power sector. What are the other implications? I mean, we've looked at many aspects in the paper. Let me just here look at the economic impacts because they're very important. And I mean, the direct impact is electricity prices. So this shows you wholesale electricity prices in cents per kilowatt hour. In black is the old target, in green again the new target. And we see in the long run, they're pretty much the same. So this fully converted system, it doesn't change much. But in between, we have quite a high spike, which comes about because on the one side, in 2025, we already have high CO2 prices. But on the other side, we still have coal in the system because as fast as we want to go with renewables, we can't shut down all coal power plants EU-wide in the next 4 years. So we have this combination, CO2 intensive generation, as well as high CO2 prices that makes prices go up quickly and then go down afterwards. We look at total power system costs, we find roughly an increase of 5%. So not nothing, but not huge either. Just to put this into perspective, if you compare to the current gas price shock, gas prices currently are around 90 euros per megawatt hour. And the years before that, they were in the range of 20. So we have an increase of roughly 70 euros per megawatt hour compared to how it was before. If we calculate what CO2 price would have been necessary to drive up the prices as much, we find something around 350 euros per ton of CO2. So if we know that, and I said modeling tells us ETS prices will be around 130, it gives some relief. The EU ETS targets can be achieved and will have a lower effect on energy prices than this crazy gas price shock we currently see. Now, what is needed? I mean, we're doing modeling. What is needed beyond a tighter ETS cap, which was the one thing that drives our model here, to make the scenario reality? Because, I mean, everybody knows we have assumptions in the models, and the most important assumptions we have in here is intertemporal foresight. Everybody in the model invests knowing that the CO2 prices will go up as they do, and therefore invests intelligently. And because of this reason, I would say the most important part for policymakers to make the scenario come reality is stabilize the expectation of high carbon prices. Let me briefly go back to historic values to explain why this is so important. Now, this is EU ETS prices from 2008 to 2019. They were, after initial high start, they dropped down and were around 10 euros per ton of CO2 for many years. Many people thought ETS would never be an important part of the solution. Then, after many years of negotiations, the MSR was passed, and this increased the belief of the market actors that the ETS will actually be important in the future. The prices went up to around 25. Unclear how the future would unfold. There are many projections saying it would stay at the level or even go down again. Then we had the EU deciding on the EU Green Deal, pushing up ETS prices, maybe in combination with other things. If you ask, if you're sitting here and you need to invest and you ask people, there are many people who say this is just speculation. Prices will just go down and then have a steady and slow increase. If you ask what the EU Commission says, you could look into the impact assessments, and you would, if you go back to 2020, this is a little bit older graph, find the impact assessment saying 60 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030. Now, no other time, there's no information on how it's in the years in between or afterwards, so maybe you just do a linear extension. You might also ask some modelers from Potsdam Institute, and they might tell you, well, actually, we think it will be rather up here. Like we have a sensitivity range, but somewhere in this range, 130, at least above 100 euros per ton of CO2. Now, put yourself into the position of a utilities person sitting here and thinking how to invest, or an industry stakeholder. that person will invest very differently if he believes this to be the future or this to be the future. And if he invests here, either he will have very, very huge amount of stranded assets in 2030 when the prices end up here, and that will put some political unrest on the table, or he will sit here and have so much lobbying power to make sure the targets are destroyed, because otherwise they would not survive in this environment of 130 euros. So really making sure that everybody in the market has expectations of high carbon prices is, in my view, the most important part to actually make this world become reality and not have huge amounts, billions put into stranded assets. I mean, the easiest way to do would be to put in carbon price floor and maybe carbon price ceiling. This is still very difficult, but it would be the easiest way of stabilizing this. If that is impossible, at least it would be important to communicate more what are the expectations from the Commission about this. And from the modeling I've seen, really the 60 euros there are very, very low and will not suffice to get industry to invest really in this world. Apart from that, there's many smaller things people can do. So it's removing the hindering regulation on RES investment, on grid expansion, storage, demand flexibility, you have it. And also because renewables are investment heavy and have low operation costs, financing costs are the most important part. So reducing risks, whether via tenders or other instruments, there are many ways that have been well researched over the last years, but this is really key to keep the transition at low costs. Now, that was the easy part. Let's turn to the difficult part, the effort sharing regulation sectors. I showed this before. We have a tightened ETS, that was what we looked at, but we also have tighter ESR targets. Now we used a full system model called Remind EU to analyze the impact, what would be the carbon prices necessary to get us there. And we find for the ETS a range of 130, similar to what we had in our more detailed model. And for the ESR, something around 280 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030. Now, that is quite a high number. Sorry. Briefly, I have to say, these calculations for the moment here are done assuming no tightening of additional policies. So only the policies that are in place now, but we don't put in it other policies. This will come later in the analysis. Now you may ask, why do those modelers think these prices are so high? Or why do they need to be so high in reality? I think the key part of this is that we are in a transformation phase. The power sector had 20 years of starting this transformation. They're in the middle part of the S-curve. They're really, everybody knows renewables, they've come down, even banks know how to finance them. So it's really, transformation is in full speed. In the ESR sectors, buildings and transport, we are at the beginning, like not the full beginning, we've had a few years, but we're not in the middle. So CO2 prices that try to push this transformation need to be higher than if you just compare what are the differential costs between technologies, like the mature technology-based costs, because there are many impeding factors. For one, as I said before, you have the uncertainty about future CO2 prices. This is bad in the ETS. It's much worse in the ESR sectors, because there you have this idea of having a new ETS system for buildings and transport. Nobody knows how exactly it will be, how tight it will be. Nobody knows what CO2 prices are expected. This really completely hinders investment into low emission technologies in these sectors. Secondly, very important, you have the principal agent problem. Just one example, car makers and customers. The person driving a car sees the CO2 price. So in 2030, that person will see a high CO2 price, will want to buy another car. But to buy a low emission car, you need somebody to have as much low emission cars ready so that all customers who want to buy one can buy one. So there's the indirect thing that car makers have to invest 5 to 10 years earlier to develop the car and put the factories on the ground to be able to supply enough battery electric vehicles. So there's indirectness of the carbon price hitting the customer, but actually somebody else having first to make huge investments is really slowing the progress. You have a chicken and egg problem. If you, whether be it be it battery electric vehicles. As long as there are no vehicles on the ground, no company will invest into infrastructure, and vice versa. Similar for district heating. Who will invest into district heating grids as long as you have cheap gas that everybody else can use if it's not enforced that you need to use the district heating? So there, this interaction really blocks. Even if everybody would want to invest into low emission technology, you then have the problem that you don't have enough skilled workers and knowledge about these technologies. So currently in Germany, you wait half a year for a plumber to come by, or a year if you want to build a new house. The books are full. Nobody of the craftsmen has any need to worry about customers wanting new things, because they have enough people who still want the old stuff. So they have no incentive to train, no incentive to develop further. And we need a lot of people to put all the construction on the ground for refurbishments, for new infrastructure, etc. Fifth, we have a status quo bias. Most end users are strongly influenced in their choice by what their friends and family do. So you have some early adopters who like new technologies, but for the majority of people, they only do something if they know everybody around them does it, which automatically makes it more difficult for new technologies to come into the market. And finally, we have high discount rates of consumers, or myopia. To illustrate this last point, let me make one simple exemplary calculation. You're a consumer, you're thinking, do I buy a heat pump or do I buy a new gas boiler? Heat pump has much higher investment cost upfront, but lower cost in usage. Gas is very cheap to install, but more expensive afterwards. If I do a full cost calculation for that for a refurbished home, you get something like this. So you see here CO2 prices, different levels of CO2 prices, and then you see the full costs over, I think, 25 years of either in black a gas system or in green a heat pump that is here powered by completely green electricity. That's why it's flat, because rising CO2 prices would have little effect on total costs. We see the intersection point is somewhere around 210 euros per ton of CO2, meaning if you have a CO2 price of 210 euros, half of the people would buy a heat pump and half would buy a gas, if that's all that matters. Like you have the plumbers to put them in, whatever. Now, if we do the same analysis at 1% discount rate, we see the interception point shifts downward to around 150 euros per ton of CO2. If we have a 10% discount rate, it shifts upward to around 300 euros. That already gives you a very large range just for the break-even point from 150 to 300 euros per ton of CO2 for discount rates between 1 and 10%, which is an okay range for businesses. But if you ask what customers implicitly use to calculate payback times, we actually found even more sobering numbers. There are many studies on this, but just one example, Green in 2011 published something, this is on cars, not in heating, but it gives you an idea that consumers expect a payback time for cars of 1.5 to 2.5 years. Now you can reconvert that into what discount rate they assume to make that calculation, and you get something more than 30%. If you have consumers with a discount rate, with an implicit discount rate in their head of more than 30%, you can completely forget about shifting their technology choice with energy or CO2 prices, because they happen in the future. And if you have such a high discount rate, you just care very little about the future. Now, we have many challenges. Luckily, there are many policy instruments that can address these impeding factors and thereby facilitate the transformation in the ESR sectors. We had the uncertainty about future CO2 prices. You can address that example by a floor price for the ESR sectors of, I would say, 200 euros per ton of CO2, because that's our modeling result. But I mean, more modeling is needed, and then you find a reasonable number that is really at the lower end. Principal agent problem, that can be overcome by tightening vehicle CO2 emission standards, because they address directly the manufacturer. They don't go via the customer, but they really tell the manufacturer, hey, 50% or 2/3 of my sales in 2030 have to be electric or have to be hydrogen. So I will now plan and build the factories before, and not expect how customers will like to buy things then. And similarly, you can make a decision to actually forbid some technologies, like phase out fossil boilers. That makes it very easy for the manufacturers to plan their investments. Issue of no skilled workers. could be overcome by support and requirements for training. Chicken and egg infrastructure in the beginning will likely need state-organized infrastructure build-up. Once you're at 10% market share, 20% market share, it's likely that there will be enough incentives for companies to go in. But beginning, I know of a lot of modeling that shows that really state intervention is needed to get these first percents on the ground and this first infrastructure build-up. Status quo bias can be overcome if you have some initial technology support, so that you have some markets, people get to know the new technology, you reduce fears, etc. And finally, on the high discount rate of consumers, the main idea is to target the investment point. So either with efficiency standards, which force the manufacturer to change what they sell, or if you do subsidies on investment or a fee-based system, that can influence people. To exemplify this here, these are the same plots you saw before. Now, if we add a 33 or 35% investment subsidy for heat pumps like we have in Germany, this pushes the total costs for the heat pump down, and it shifts this point where they intercept to the left. You can see that it shifts most strongly for the high discount rate. So before, we had a range of 150 to 300 euros, and now with this subsidy, we bring them again closer together to this 60 to 120 euros per ton of CO2. Or as I said before, you could simply remove a technology option. Given this, as Henrik Lund pointed out, the scarcity that we expect for biomass in the future and also for hydrogen, it might make sense to simply say this is not necessary in large scale for the heating sector, for buildings. So we could simply say we phase out new gas boilers and new gas boilers and take this decision off the table. Now, going one step back to our full system analysis, we had these preliminary, these first results. When we don't have additional policies, we find a quite high difference between the needed CO2 prices in the ESR sector, 280, 130 in the ETS. So we have two levers to reduce this very strong pressure in the ESR sector. One is simply, any economist will tell you, shift the burden to the part where it's cheaper, so to the ETS. If we put all the additional effort into the ETS, ESR would stay at the old target, ETS would get a much tighter target, prices would shift so that now ETS is more expensive than the ESR. Or you could take a middle road, just where you split the new, split the ESR contribution 50% to the ETS and 50% to the ESR, and then you'd get a range of around 190 euros per ton of CO2 in both systems, which any economist will like. Same prices, supposed to be efficient. Secondly, reduce barriers via additional policies. Now, I described a lot of policies. We're not yet there to have put all of them in the large full system model REMIND-EU, but we've taken a first step, taking final energy efficiency target, car performance standards, and renewable energy requirements in. And when we analyze this, and please, these are preliminary results, they will surely change a bit in the future, but I think it's important to already speak about the expected sizes. We see that the new efficiency target proposed on the final energy level, that actually in our model makes the whole system more efficient, bringing down the ESR prices from 280 euros per ton of CO2 to 240 euros per ton of CO2. Not yet huge, but it's a step, and we're still looking into exact modeling of this. If we secondly look at the car performance standards, we do see no direct effect, because in our scenarios to achieve the 2030 targets, the model tells us it's already cost efficient to have battery electric vehicle sales shares of above 70% in 2030. So the model does by itself more than the target will be. So clearly there's no direct effect. But you can argue that having such light duty vehicle standards will have an impact on manufacturers, that they accelerate their investment into battery electric vehicle production, because they know they have a fixed amount they need to sell in 2030. So they will build up the plants already in 2025, 2027, etc. And so if we assume that and put this assumption into the model, we see this would reduce FHR regulation prices from the 240 we had with the efficiency target to 190 euros per ton of CO2. And anyway, like the most important part of this is the 100% target in 2035, because that clearly acts as a safeguard against stranded investments by manufacturers. If they know, like if you have a 60% target, you can still hope, okay, I'll squeeze in the 40% that are still allowed of ICE vehicles. If you're at 100%, it's very clear you don't sell any ICE vehicles anymore. Finally, on the renewable energy targets, we have a similar finding that there's no direct effect, simply because given the cost reductions we've seen in PV and wind, and given the importance of biomass to the system, the 2030 targets leads to much higher residues anyway in our model. But still, there is a point that these targets can have a positive effect on the transformation, making it more robust, because they prevent a slower scale up, and member states and investors who don't believe that the targets will be held, like the general emission targets will be held, still are being pushed by the rest targets. Last point I want to make is the need for social recompensation. Now, with the gas price crisis, we clearly put a lot of pressure on poorer households. And carbon prices, if you just put carbon prices in the system, they again will surely increase energy expenditures for many poor people. As if you're a poor person, you don't have much money to invest into emission-free alternatives. But if you just now reduce carbon prices, make the targets weaker, as proposed by some member states, this will do very little against the energy price crisis that we currently have, because as I showed before, the gas price spike is much higher than the CO2 effect. So you can't deal with this very large gas price spike if you just turn the small knob on the CO2 prices currently. And so we would say it's much more important to go to the root of the problem, address the poverty, instead of making the climate policies weaker and thereby risking the 2030 targets and making the long-term challenges much more harder. And there are many studies that show that the revenues from carbon pricing can make carbon pricing progressive, e.g. via lump sum returns, or there are many options. I can't list them all here. And I mean, the Commission is planning to do this with the Just Transition funds and other parts of this, but this is really key. Don't change the incentives to go carbon neutral, but make sure everybody can manage these incentives by providing the necessary funds. To conclude, if the Fit for 55 emission targets for 2030 should be achieved mainly via CO2 prices, then we need something around 130 euros per ton of CO2 in the ETS in 2030 and around 280 euros per ton of CO2 in the ESR sectors. If you have such ETS prices, power sector would fundamentally transform. You would have an EU-wide coal phase out by 2030, and gas-based power generation will already be reduced by more than half. There are a number of competing factors that can slow the transformation and thereby lead to these very high CO2 prices that are needed to achieve the reduction targets. And these are most pressing in the ESR sectors. But luckily, with enabling policy instruments, you can address these competing factors, thus increase the effect of the CO2 prices and facilitate the transformation. We looked at a few of the Fit for 55 enabling policies, and we find some of them, or all of them, increase the robustness so that you will get there even if some people don't believe in the CO2 target that's above everything. And we find that some of them actually can potentially increase the effectiveness so that pushing them all the way to the target. But they might need to become more ambitious if you really want to reduce the marginal abatement, the marginal costs, so the CO2 prices that would evolve in the ETS or in the ETS2 that is going to be implemented. Lastly, if you like this decade until 2030 is going to be very hard, especially in these ESR sectors. And if you want to reduce that burden a little bit, you could shift part of it to the ETS, because there we're much more in the transformation and things will likely have less negative social impact. And lastly, it is really paramount to stabilize the expectation of high CO2 prices until 2030 or beyond. For example, by setting a floor price of 100 in the ETS or 200 in the ESR. But if that's not possible, it's still by talking more about the expected prices and making sure they really match to bottom-up calculation of what is needed to incentivize these investments. Otherwise, any business leader will be completely lost and invest on the wrong information, invest on expectations of 60 euros per ton of CO2, and then be in a very painful spot in 2030 if CO2 prices rise higher. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen briefly. I want to thank you for that talk. We're moving on to the final talk in today's session, which is going to be from Rafael Garrafa from the Joint Research Center in Sevilla. As I said before, Diana's talk is going to be moved to the poster session. So with that having said, Rafael, over to you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anthony. Good morning, everyone. Happy to share my screen with you guys. Just one second. Probably not well. Let me try to do.
No, we see your. It's not quite right. We see your slide
Okay,
you want to show and your next slide, so you have the wrong one.
Okay. Now I think now we're
there. We go. That looks good.
That's great.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great.
So thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to present today the global and energy climate outlook for 2021. We're moving towards a net zero emissions world. That's quite good news, as we've been discussing along the presentations. So this is, I'm also glad to present this because I'm just joined the JRC at Seville, the European Commission. So I'm presenting this on behalf of many other co-authors. The list would be too long to display here in the first slide. So just to tell that this has been a report that was first produced, the GECO, the Global and Energy Climate Outlook, was first produced in the run-up of the Paris Conference of the Parties in 2015 to calculate mainly what the policy pledges would imply. And since then, the GECO has been published annually by the JRC and the European Commission to provide the updates on such policies and to investigate specific topics such as air pollution, such as electrification of the energy system, of the economy, and so on. So in this year's edition, we look at the pledges made ahead of Glasgow, which is the main topic of this session, I guess. And we first assess our, let's say, current policies in this scenario, in our first scenario, I would say, which are policies already measured already in place. Then second, we move to take stock of the nationally determined contributions, along with the long-term strategies and the net zero pledges of these parties. Then we contrast these two scenarios with a third scenario, which projects at 1.5, which actually projects 1.5 pathways. So this is pretty much based on a detailed modeling and analysis with regional and sectoral detail. So that in the next slide, I will briefly show you an overview of what the modeling framework we use is actually. And after that, we jump into a few results. So far, global results, but in this year's report, we're also providing a lot of regional detail with country fact sheets, which I will describe further. So to build GECO, we actually rely on several models for multi-dimensional analysis, so to say. So we first, of course, start with common assumptions for exogenous drivers like GDP and population, as you can see here. Then we move into what I think it's the core contribution from the modeling part, which comes from the global energy system, the post JRC energy system model that provides projection of the regional energy balances with high detailed projections for many countries. Also taking into account inputs from land use and land use change and forestry from other sources like Globine, which is a model built on EASA, to project GHG emissions. And at this point, which is quite interesting, and to highlight some, to add to one of the points that Anthony actually mentioned, and many of you already mentioned, which is sort of the idea of integration and the role of modelers. Not only energy modelers will be busy for the next few years, but of course land use modelers seems to be as well busy as such for the next few years, given the challenges to come in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So just to make this parenthesis, but moving forward, I would like to highlight the further integration between the energy and land use systems with the economics framework, which is something that I've been personally more involved to. And in that sense, we rely also, of course, on the same common assumptions that go into the economic modeling, that go into the energy system, go into the economic modeling. And besides that, I would like to highlight that there is an important core or a core part of this modeling, which is the baseline projections that are built on this platform called Pyramid, which is a platform that was mainly built to reconcile and realign input-output data and project this input-output data in a consistent baseline, taking into account the information from the energy systems. So this guarantees a strong representation of the technology developments that come from poles into the economic modeling framework first, and also make sure that we are replicating the correct, the right pathways for energy and emissions. So we, by doing this, this starting point from Pyramid, we have this baseline projected, and then this feeds into the JRC geometry model, which is a CG model, a global CG model with a great level of detail for the EU regions. And this consists mainly on our framework to assess the three scenarios that I've shown you on the previous slide. In addition to these outputs from poles, poles can also provide outputs, or also provides actually outputs to climate models like MAGIC and FAIR. So we can assess the climate response in terms of temperature change, and also to other models like GAINS to assess the dynamics of our air pollutants. This was not the main focus of this current edition of the GECO, but was mostly used in past editions where air pollution was had a special section there to cover what were the implications in terms of GHG emissions and so on. So basically, these are our modeling framework. One other point to highlight is that a lot of people is involved in this framework, and that adds to what I've mentioned in the first slide, with many co-authors contributing to this report, but also to highlight the complexity of having this sort of multidimensional analysis, and the way we look forward to integration across models, which is something that I think Henry correctly mentioned. Henrik correctly mentioned in his presentation, or one of the Q&A one of the questions that arose in the Q&A as well. Now turning to some of the global results. This is, of course, a pre-release of the GECO, so more to come after the Glasgow COP, and that will be available in the report. Let me first show you how global GHG emissions and corresponding temperature change would evolve under these three pathways. So in the first red line here, we can see our current policy scenario, which grows roughly around a bit lower than 60 gigatons of CO2 equivalent up to 2035, and then stabilizes all over the pathway. And here we can see that these current policy scenarios, the one in the red line, would deliver us a temperature of around an increase in temperature of around 3 degrees Celsius on 2100. So in that sense, what we see in the blue line here is the second scenario that I mentioned, which is the NDC LTS scenario. Let me try to hide this. Sorry. Where we can see that delivering on NDCs and net zero pledges would imply a temperature increase of about 2.2 degrees, which is actually a quite substantial difference if we compare to the last year's or GECO 29 edition, where we had about 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels on 2100. So this is mainly because, of course, we are now accounting for net zero pledges, which we can see here. That has a great effect after 2030, especially on the blue line. But of course, that will stabilize somehow because not all countries have already announced their net zero pledges before ahead of COP. So that's the reason why we see some stabilization after 2050 here. But also we can see we saw a huge increase in ambition in the short term of the updated NDCs, and also due to technological development improvements that are accounted into the model. Somehow this pathway of which shows us 2.2 actually increase into 100 would contrast and would represent, of course, what we refer to as implementation gap, which is the distance of having policies already in place and the targets announced by the parties. However, if we move further and in our ambition, and we are now referring to our ambition gap, that will be not sufficient to be in line with Paris Agreement targets. So in that sense, our 1.5 scenarios lead actually to net zero emissions around 2070, between 2070 and between 2080, with a strong push from the long-term strategy, as we can see mostly in the next slides, where I can show you the effects of the energy transition. Here shown, we can see in this picture the primary energy in gigaton TOE, for these three scenarios. In the red line, again, we have the current policies, the NDC LTS in the dotted yellow line, and the 1.5 scenarios here represented in the 1.5 and in the dotted green lines. And here we disaggregate the total primary energy supply across scenarios. We can see here particularly a strong phase out of coal, particularly for electricity generation in the 1.5 scenarios. Here the coal represented in the brown area, but also other strong decrease from that we can observe in the use of natural gas, in contrast with an increased use of nuclear, renewables, and also biomass used for electricity generation in the 1.5 scenarios. In addition to some efficiency gains that we can observe on the next slide, where we detailed the current abatement options that we rely on our scenarios. So moving towards the next slide, we can see that many abatement options contribute to these results. I would like to highlight some of them. Here we can see on the left panel results for 2030, and on the right panel results for 2050. Also related to the current policy scenarios, which are the blue bars here on the left. So here we can see the decomposition, an increased participation of wind and renewable energies coming from solar and wind sources. Also somehow, to a lesser extent, from hydro power generation in the green, mainly in the green, dark green areas here. So the huge transformation, the largest emission reductions would come from the transformation in the energy system. But also we can see, as I mentioned before, some role of efficiency and other abatement options that contribute to this target. In a lesser extent, we rely also on CCS and negative emission technologies, which are represented here in the gray area, but also with some additional effort coming from land use and land use change with non-CO2 gases abatement measures. So this is mostly the overview of abatement options at the global level. Of course, that will vary a lot concerning regional details. But before mentioning what are the implications in some of our representation of the regional details, I would like to show another section that in the GECO report would be highlighted, which is the economics of transition. And here I'm showing you in this graph the global transition of jobs from across different sectors. So we will also discuss the impacts of employment levels across these sectors. And in the height of the bars, we can see the employment level for each of these sectors in 2050. So we can see the differences across sectors, of course. While in the horizontal axis, we see the change from current policies in 2050 in the bars, and in 2030 in the dots. Probably not very visual right now, but I can at least say that for 2030 the change is not very substantial, except for the fossil fuel sector. However, which is a sector that, as you can see here, the employment levels are not that high. So in contrast with the big change that occurs after 2030 in both scenarios, and the NDCs in the dark areas and the 1.5C, 1.5 scenarios in the light areas, we see that, of course, a global transition occurs from fossil fuel oriented sectors to decarbonized sectors like electricity generation, and also for mainly for bioenergy, which is accounted here in agriculture. So we can see increased opportunities in these sectors that actually contribute to absorb many of these jobs losses here. And also to mention that the losses here in the service sector are not very substantial, and we can see actually growth in these scenarios, but as compared to the current policies, there are small losses. We can also see in these results some growth coming from electrification in energy-intensive industry that is being pushed. For instance, for aluminum sectors, also for transport, but mostly I would like to highlight the growth in construction sector due to the deployment of renewable technologies and the infrastructure required to advance towards this transition. So these are one of the aspects that is already also covered in the GECO report. And now coming to my few last slides, I would like to also highlight this dimension that global results might hide regional heterogeneity. So in GECO 2021, we also include fact sheets for G20 countries. So they look like more or less like this, with a 2 to 3 pages summary covering the background of climate policies in these countries, the assessment of emission pathways and the abatement options there. And we can see there the heterogeneity between regions on the level of implementation and ambition gaps. Coming to my conclusions, and I hope I made it in time, we can see that current policies lead to a temperature increase of about 3 degrees Celsius, as I showed you in the first slides. But then delivering on the nationally determined contributions and to net zero pledges brings the planet towards the Paris Agreement targets. We're here about 2.2, but of course we need more, and a sizable ambition gap remains to achieve 1.5 degree, both in the short and the long term. So our report highlights these regional differences in abatement options and in ambition gaps, and will be available soon at this link I am sharing with you here, including the energy balances, the IO tables that will be also available there for modeling purposes, which is something that we strongly encourage in terms of transparency and in terms of being open to scrutiny in that sense, and also bringing socioeconomic implications and detailed G20 country analysis. I'll stop here, and I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity again to share these reflections on the GECO. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Raphael. Tony Pat had to leave for another commitment, so I've seamlessly taken over as the host. Since our other panelists have had time to answer some of the questions, or actually all of the questions in writing already, but you haven't had that opportunity, so I'll give you the opportunity right now to respond to some of the questions that have come up And the first one I'm seeing here is why do you still have gas and oil in the energy mix of 2050? Doesn't that contrast with the EU target of climate neutrality?
Well, for the global results, we indeed see some gas and oil there. That is mainly in line with many of the NDC pledges. For instance, to mention one of the latest would be Saudi Arabia, that's recently announced that net zero pledges for 2060, which actually rely on much more on other abatement technologies, but keeping its role as a supplier of oil and gas for the global market. So in that sense, the transition relies pretty much on, of course, the electrification of the energy system, efficiency measures, but somehow in the use of gas and oil for many countries that don't have that as strong as EU or other countries, main countries' pledges in terms of their long-term strategy. In that sense, we still see some use of oil and gas in the global figures there. Yes.
Great, I think that's clear. Maybe one other question. Can you say something about the job changes and GDP changes due to transition policies, and maybe also specifically regarding someone specifically asking about agriculture sector?
Yes, agriculture is a sector that is quite affected by the transformation of the energy system moving towards bioenergy. In that sense, is a highly intensive labor intensive sector. So we see that the agriculture sector somehow absorbs many of the fossil fuel sectors jobs. So in that sense, what we can see from our results in terms of growth would be mostly happening in these, let's say, decarbonized sectors. Regarding GDP, we don't have the final numbers for the socioeconomic part, so I will miss this. I will skip these impacts for you, but mostly what we can see that for short-term and mid-term impacts, these are not very considerable, given that we are transitioning based on a huge push for investment in terms of decarbonizing the electricity sector. In that sense, that accounts for a great contribution to the overall economic activity. So we don't see actually losses in that, I would say, in the short term. But of course, moving towards higher ambition might represent higher changes, but I don't have these numbers, these final numbers so far. So I would prefer not to show until the final report comes out.
Great, thanks, Raphael. There's one or two more questions that have come up, and I'll suggest that maybe you can try to answer those in writing. What I would like to do actually now, since we still have about 15 minutes of time left, and since all the other panelists have done such a good job of already answering all their questions in writing, this is the energy modeling platform conference, and so I would like to take the opportunity to actually address a question to all of the panelists who are still here with us. What would you say are the biggest gaps in modeling right now, in terms of the effort needed in the next couple of years, given the planning, the policy, and the market decisions that have to happen in the next couple of years to achieve say the Fit for 55 goals? What modeling what are the gaps in modeling? Henrik, I see you've unmuted yourself, so do you want to have a go?
Thank you very much for the question, and also for all the questions in the chat. And also maybe I can follow up a little bit on those questions in the chat while answering your overall question here. I mean, there are different types of gaps, you can say, but if I start with addressing what I could mention was the what we could call the technical gaps. What is it that we are not technical good at analyzing, and that we should be better at analyzing in our models? If I start with that, then there's a whole other range of discussions as well. But how I see it is that many of our models in general have started in the electricity sector, and is pretty good at doing that, and it's also still having a strong focus there. Where I really see a gap if we talk average modeling, that is the heating sector, and especially the great potentials for district heating. To me, it's disturbing to see the clean planet scenarios and so on coming out without even considering the potential benefit we would have out of recycling all the waste heat that we also will have in the future system. So I think, and I could boil that down to a modeling issue, that those models being used are not really equipped to do that. So I think that being able to model the district heating, being able to map where the future potential excess heat potentials are, and being able to grab that and put into the model. With the heat roadmap Europe scenarios, we have proven that there's really a lot of benefit there, both in terms of money, also in terms of not having such a high pressure on how many wind turbines and biomass we would need by the end of the day. So that's one major gap I see right now. And if I should mention another one, it's more like the challenge we have right now, and that is the integration between not only the electricity and the heating and the transport and everything, but then with what is also mentioned here by Raphael and the questions and so on, the agricultural sector, the process and the carbon capture and the whole decarbonization. And here I see that we are way behind understanding the integration, the need for integrating biomass conversion technologies, and the whole understanding on how the agricultural sector is influenced by if we have biogas or not biogas, and how this is converted and so on, and all the other biomass conversion technologies and the interaction with the whole industry. That's also where I see a lack in modeling. And this also, I mean, if we define the transport sector broader than just electric cars and electric trucks and so on, and also include the aviation and the shipping, then we also have an enormous challenge, not only in the modeling, but also in finding the solutions to do that within the limits of sustainable biomass. And there I can also see a big challenge for the modeling. I will stop here. That was only the technical part of it. Then there's the whole what Robert have addressed, the whole implementation and so on part of it and so on.
Thanks, and great. Yeah, actually, Robert, this is a good cue, sort of taking up this question of going beyond electricity. What about policies that worked well in electricity, like PV feed-in tariffs to push in PV? What about translating those or using such policies in sectors beyond electricity? How does that jam with carbon pricing?
Very much. It does very much. So I mean, at least in Germany, carbon contracts for differences have been all the rage in the last year for industry decarbonization, and there are big projects starting on that, which are based on the idea that because future carbon prices are uncertain and nobody knows if they will go up as high as needed to make clean technologies competitive, you make these carbon contracts for differences where you actually get paid out if the CO2 price is not high enough, creating a double incentive for the industry to invest into clean technologies and the regulators to make sure to actually have a tendency to increase CO2 prices that counteracts all the pressure to keep it low. So I would say that's just one of the many policies that are out there, and I think many of them are needed. So if I should raise 3 points, or like the 3 areas I see most critical for modeling are technology scale up and take up of new technologies as the first one. Like there has been a lot of research on that, but still it seems we're not yet good enough to make recipes out of them, to look at how was the really fast scale up of heat pumps in Sweden, Norway, Finland achieved, and how can we learn from that translated to Germany, to the UK, to all the other places that are struggling. There is growth, but not as fast. And if we have a better understanding of how this works, can put it into the models and can put it into the policies, that would be really helpful. Secondly, the policies, how do policies drive take up? How do policies drive behavior? I mean, we've decades of experience with carbon pricing modeling, and we have a lot of on the ground research, individual towns that have implemented some measures. How do they interact? What's missing a bit is this link. How can you better represent the impact that dedicated policies may have on the behavior on average on a nation level, to include that in the pathways to know what they will do till 2030 and 2050. And thirdly, the social impact, like looking even, I mean, Raphael, you looked at jobs, that is crucial. Similarly, looking at who suffers, who has to bear the brunt of the costs, that I think is very, very important for politicians and policymakers to really be able to enact these changes and to think ahead, create the right incentive structures and the right programs so that you have the necessary funds to make it to soften the blow, so to say. I think these 3 things would be my key priorities. And if I may say, like make one more point, Tony asked, why not just do it through regulation? Like he sent me before leaving, he sent me a short message. Why do we need the carbon price at all? Can't we just say you make so high performance standards on everything and then that solves the problem? And I would say there are 3 reasons that I see why a pure regulation approach would be inferior to a mixed approach that has both, that has carbon pricing and regulation and standards. The first one is the variety of uses. Performance works well if you have a clear market and a clear technology that you can regulate. For CO2 targets, you need to do this through every single technology, every single energy use. And that takes a lot of time just to get these standards set. And so the carbon price, it's brutally difficult to get through politically, but at least it acts on all of these technologies at the same time. So that's why it has an advantage there. Secondly, use phase. When you have technology, you have the investment phase and you have the use phase. The investment phase, it's very easy to directly address with regulation. Performance standards, we've named them all. In the use phase, it's very hard with the regulation. Like you can't make a regulation. People are only allowed to drive 10,000 kilometers a year. And that is something where prices do come in and behavior is influenced by price. If you have free gasoline or free electricity, people will behave differently, drive more than if you have somewhat priced gasoline or electricity. So that's why we need, for the use phase, prices do matter. And thirdly, the revenues. If you only do it through standards and regulation, you don't have revenues to really help those people who are hit worst and hardest. With carbon prices, you get some revenues that you can then use to soften the blow. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. Andreas, I'm looking towards you in terms of your perspective from the Commission anything to add on the points raised by Henrik and Robert, or anything else to add on this topic of where are the gaps in modeling?
Yeah, I would.
Only
sorry, that was for me. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Sorry, Stefan. I thought you mentioned.
No worries. We'll let Andreas go first and then get back to you.
Okay. Sorry. Go on.
Stefan, everyone, of course. First of all, we have a session on this afternoon, and maybe I should advertise this session. So this is the best place for the question, but maybe I'm going to just in this. I would go as far to say that the difference between the mathematical formulation and a model, and what a model can do and what a model should do, and I think there's we spend a lot of time in the Commission, and that is absolutely understandable, explaining why we model pathways. And that this has less to do with the tools we use and their capabilities. That Henrik has mentioned are included in the tools we use, and we continue improving them. But the reason the scenario they are has a lot to do with our policies and with the way design policies, design scenarios on policies, states and on European level, because one must not forget that the modeling we do has a purpose, and this purpose is policy making on the European level. So any assessment we do is actually happening in the context of a legal proposal. So we do model proposals for legislation to be applied on the European level, complemented by crucial information we get from member states. And in mind when you ask yourself about why we are not going to a certain direction. But happy to expand on it in the discussion that Andrzej Zeglas will moderate later after lunch.
Great, Andreas. Yes, there will be plenty of opportunities to discuss this in depth. We have a couple of minutes left, so Raphael, if you want to add any final points from your perspective.
Yeah, one thing that I would like to highlight is also the integration with consumer surveys and microsimulation models. This is something that we are keen to progress in our research activities here in the JRC. So we're trying to look more closely on these sort of impacts that Robert mentioned in terms of pricing. He mentioned some electricity prices growing like I would say 5%. Okay, that's quite substantial for some income classes, even in more developed countries. So we're trying to look more into this integration. That's I think that's an important feature to have in our in every modeling efforts that deals with climate change as well. So yeah, that would be one additional reflection to the others that I mentioned for land use change, and forestry, which were already discussed previously. So yeah.
Super, thanks, Raphael. This is perfect timing wise. We have 1 minute left until 12, so that just leaves me enough time to thank everyone again for your interesting presentations. Thanks also to the audience for your questions. I think most or all of them have been answered or in the process of being answered right now. I think the last one just went. So thanks everyone again. And just hoping to see you in the various parallel sessions, which, reminder again, starts from 2 p.m. Thanks everyone, and have a good lunch break.
Thank you. Bye-bye.